The morning Harlan Voss rode onto Celia Kingsley's land with a deed in his hand and a smirk on his sun-cracked face. She was standing at the fence line with nothing but a broken-handled shovel and a jaw set hard enough to crack stone. It was the spring of 1878, and the territory of New Mexico was not a forgiving place. The red dirt stretched out for miles in every direction around the Kingsley homestead, a spread of 240 acres that her husband, Thomas Kingsley, had poured 6 years of sweat and blood into before a fever took him in the autumn of 1877. 6 months had passed since they buried him on the hill behind the house, beneath the old juniper tree whose roots had grown as deep and stubborn as the man himself. 6 months of Celia waking before dawn, feeding the cattle, mending fences, paying the hands what little she could afford, and keeping the whole thing from unraveling like a worn rope. She had done it. She had held it together by sheer will and the knowledge that this land was Thomas's dream made real, and she would not let it go. But Harlan Voss did not much care about dreams. He was a land broker out of Santa Fe, a man with soft hands and a hard heart, and he had been circling the Kingsley property for 2 years, ever since he got word that Thomas was ailing. He rode up to the fence on a fine gray horse with 2 men behind him who wore matching expressions of disinterest, and he held the deed out from his saddle as though offering her a gift. "Mrs. Kingsley," he said, tipping his hat with the practiced courtesy of a man who had done this many times before and found it easy, "I expect you've been waiting on word from the land office." Celia set the shovel against the post and looked at him steadily. She was 31 years old, with dark auburn hair pulled back under a wide-brimmed hat, and eyes the color of river water after a hard rain, a shade between green and gray that changed depending on her mood. She had spent the better part of the winter writing letters to the land office in Santa Fe, because Thomas had filed an amendment to their original claim 2 years prior, expanding the eastern boundary by 40 acres that had been unclaimed territory at the time. She had not yet received confirmation, but she had also not received a denial. She had been patient. "I have not been waiting on anything from you, Mr. Voss," she said. He smiled. It was the kind of smile that did not reach the eyes. Be that as it may, the land office processed the claim review. Seems there was a competing survey. Fellow named Carroll filed on that eastern 40 back in 76, just 3 weeks before your husband did. That makes his claim senior. He unfolded the paper and held it higher, as though the distance between them required the gesture. "He sold his claim to me last month, legal and registered. That means the eastern pasture, the creek bed, and the south water access belong to me now, Mrs. Kingsley." Celia felt the ground shift under her, not physically, but in the way that news sometimes makes the world feel suddenly rearranged. The eastern pasture and the creek bed. That was where she watered the cattle. Without the creek access, she could not sustain the herd through summer. Without the herd, there was no income. Without income, she could not pay the note on the rest of the property. Voss knew all of this. He had done his arithmetic carefully. "I want to see that deed," she said. He folded it back up and tucked it into his coat. "You're welcome to come to Santa Fe and review it at the land office. I filed the transfer last Tuesday. It's all recorded proper." He gathered his reins and looked over the land with a speculative expression, as though he were already imagining what to do with it. "I'll be back in 2 weeks to begin marking the boundary. In the meantime, I'd suggest you consider my offer on the remainder of the property. I've been more than fair." His offer was $400 for the whole of the remaining 200 acres, the house, the barn, and the outbuildings included. $400 for everything Thomas had built. She had laughed the first time he made it back in January. She did not laugh now, but her answer was the same. "Get off my fence line, Mr. Voss," she said. He rode away without urgency, the way men do when they believe time is working for them. Celia stood at the fence for a long time after the dust from his horses settled. She picked up the shovel, not because she needed to dig anything, but because she needed something in her hands, and she walked back to the house. Her daughter, me, 7 years old and serious in the way children become when they have watched a parent carry grief, was sitting on the porch steps with a book open in her lap, though she was watching the road where the riders had gone. "Was that the bad man?" me asked. Celia sat down beside her on the steps and put an arm around her thin shoulders. "He is a difficult man," she said carefully, "but we are going to be fine." She said it because she had to say it. She was not entirely sure it was true. That evening, after she had fed me supper and read to her until she fell asleep, Celia sat at the kitchen table with a lantern and spread out every paper she had relating to the property. Thomas's original claim, the amendment filing, the survey maps, the correspondence with the land office. She read through everything twice, looking for something she might have missed, some angle or argument she could make. The problem was that she was not a lawyer, and the language of land deeds and survey records was not her native tongue. Thomas had handled all of it, and he had been good at it, but he was gone. She needed help, real help. Not the kind that the two remaining hired hands on the property could offer, because they were good men with cattle and horses, but could no more argue a land claim than they could fly. She needed someone who understood the law, or at least understood the territory well enough to know how to fight. The next morning she rode into the town of Cimarron, which was the nearest town of any size, a place of maybe 400 souls that had grown up around the Lucian Maxwell land grant territory, and had more than a passing familiarity with land disputes. The Maxwell grant had generated a full-scale war in this part of the territory just a few years prior, and Cimarron had the scars to prove it. But it also had lawyers, a land office satellite, and, as Celia was about to discover, a particular man sitting in front of the Cimarron Hotel on a wooden chair, reading what appeared to be a land surveying manual with the intensity of someone who was not doing it casually. His name was Walter Alden, and Celia did not know it yet. She had come to find Gerald Marsh, the land attorney who had offices above the dry goods store, but Gerald Marsh had a note on his door saying he was in Santa Fe on business and would return in 10 days. 10 days was 9 days too many. Celia stood on the boardwalk outside his office and let out a slow breath, pressing her lips together, which was the closest she permitted herself to public despair. "You look like someone who just found out the lawyer is out of town." She turned. The man on the hotel porch had looked up from his book. He was perhaps 34 or 35, lean in the way of men who work outdoors, with sun-darkened skin and dark eyes that held something patient and attentive in them. He wore a plain work shirt, dusty trousers, and boots that had seen considerable use. There was a quality about him of having arrived somewhere after a long journey and not quite decided whether to stay. "That is exactly what happened," Celia said, because there was no point in pretense. He closed his book and set it on the railing beside him. "What kind of legal trouble?" She studied him for a moment. "Do you know anything about land claims in this territory?" "A fair amount," he said. "I spent 3 years working land survey for the federal office in Denver before they sent me down here to review grant boundary disputes. I'm Walter Alden." She crossed the street and shook his hand, noting that it was calloused in the particular way of someone who worked with rope and tools. "Celia Kingsley. I have a homestead 8 miles northeast of here, and a land broker is trying to strip my creek access by using a competing claim he purchased. He says the original filing was senior to my husband's amendment." Walter Alden's expression sharpened with interest. "What year was the amendment filed?" "Autumn of 1876. "And the competing claim?" "He says July of 1876, 3 weeks prior." Walter was quiet for a moment, then he picked up his book, stood from the chair, and said, "Can you show me your papers? I'd like to look at the original surveys." They spent 3 hours at a table inside the hotel, spreading out everything Celia had brought. Walter read carefully, methodically, asking questions in a low voice that had a Western flatness to it, but was careful with consonants in the way of someone who had been educated before he ended up in the territory. He was from Kansas originally, he told her at one point, though he had been working the territory for 6 years. He knew this land, its boundaries, its disputed history. He had seen Harlan Voss's name in documents before. "Carol's claim," he said at last, looking up from the survey map. "Did Voss show you the actual deed from the land office?" "He showed me a paper. He did not let me hold it. I'd want to see it." "The reason I ask is that Carol's filing in this district would have gone through the Taos land office in 1876, not Santa Fe, because the district boundary shifted in 1877. If Voss filed the transfer in Santa Fe without cross-referencing the original registration jurisdiction, there's a procedural argument to be made. It wouldn't invalidate the claim outright, but it could delay the transfer and give you time to challenge the survey." Celia looked at him. "Is that enough to stop him?" Walter leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, the way a man does when he is being honest with himself. "It might be enough to slow him down. If we can get the original survey records from Taos and show a discrepancy in the boundary marks, we have a real argument. But I want to be straight with you, Mrs. Kingsley. Voss is connected. He has done business in Santa Fe for years, and he knows the clerks and the officers. Going against him is not going to be simple." "I am not asking for simple," Celia said. "I am asking whether it can be done." He looked at her directly then, and something in his expression settled into a kind of resolve that she would come to recognize as characteristic of him. "Yes," he said, "it can be done." That was how it started. Walter Alden had been in Cimarron on government survey work, a temporary assignment reviewing the Maxwell Grant boundary documents, and he had been planning to return to Denver at the end of the week. He delayed his return. He rode out to the Kingsley property the following morning to see the land himself, because he had learned early in his career that maps and deeds told only part of the story, and the land itself often told the rest. Celia met him at the gate and walked with him along the eastern boundary, through the dry grass and the scattered juniper, down to the creek bed that ran shallow but steady through the corner of her property. It was early April, and the air still had a bite to it in the mornings, sharp and clean with the smell of pine from the hills to the north. Walter walked the line carefully, noting the survey marks on the fence posts and the rock cairns that Thomas had used as reference points. He pulled out a compass and a small notebook and made notations as he went. Celia walked beside him, telling him what she knew about how Thomas had staked the claim, what conversations he had had with the land office, what the neighbors' boundaries looked like. She found herself talking more than she intended to. It had been a long winter of not having anyone to talk to about the practical realities of the situation, of being careful around me, of presenting a calm face to the hired hands, of writing careful professional letters to clerks who responded with carefully professional non-answers. Walter Alden listened the way some people read, with full attention, not interrupting but occasionally asking a precise question that showed he had heard everything. "Your husband made good choices with the fence line," he said at one point, crouching near a stake at the corner of the eastern pasture. "He used natural features as anchors. That's smart. It makes it harder to argue the boundary was uncertain." "Thomas was a thorough man," Celia said, and her voice did a thing at the end that she did not intend, not quite breaking but changing register. She stopped and looked out over the pasture where the cattle were moving slowly in the morning light and the juniper cast long shadows eastward. Walter did not look at her when he spoke next. He kept his eyes on the survey mark. "How long were you married?" 8 years, she said. "He was a good man." "I'm sorry." It was simply said, and it was enough. She appreciated that he did not elaborate, did not add the usual assurances about time and healing that people offered with good intentions, but which landed like small weights rather than comfort. They walked back to the house in a companionable quiet, and Celia made coffee on the cast iron stove and cut 2 pieces of the cornbread she had made that morning. Mia appeared in the kitchen doorway with her book, looked at Walter with the frank appraisal of a child deciding something, and then came and sat at the table. "Are you a cowboy?" she asked. Walter looked at her with a seriousness that matched her own. "I have done cowboy work," he said, "but right now I am a land surveyor." What does that mean? It means I measure land and figure out who it belongs to. Me thought about this. Do you think our land belongs to us? I think your mother's land absolutely belongs to her, Walter said, and I intend to help prove it. Me seemed satisfied with this and opened her book. Celia poured the coffee and set a cup in front of him, and when she turned back to the stove, she allowed herself a moment to feel something that was not grief or worry or determination. She was not ready to name it yet. She was not sure she was ready for anything like it. But it was there, like the first green shoot after a hard frost, unexpected and tentative and alive. Walter rode back to Cimarron that afternoon with a list of records he needed to pull, and a plan that he had outlined to Celia over the second cup of coffee. He would write to the Taos land office for Carol's original filing. He would pull the survey logs from the federal archive for that section of Colfax County. He would also speak to a man he knew at the Santa Fe office, a man named Hector Diaz who owed him a professional courtesy and who could tell him whether Voss's transfer had been properly cross-referenced. It would take about a week to gather all of it. Celia watched him ride down the road from the porch, one hand shading her eyes against the afternoon sun, and then she went back to work because work was what the land required, and she had never been the kind of woman to stand still for long. The week was not idle for anyone. Celia's hired hands, brothers named Pete and Sam Greer, had heard about Voss's claim and were quietly worried. They had been with Thomas since the beginning of the homestead, and they were loyal to the land in the way men become loyal to places they have built something in. Pete Greer, the elder at 38, came to Celia on the second day and told her flat out that he and Sam were not going anywhere regardless of what happened with the wages if things got tight. Celia felt that offer land in her chest like a warm stone. I will pay what I owe, she said. We will not be in trouble. She was not entirely sure of that, but she believed it enough to say it with conviction, and Pete nodded and went back to his work, which was the kind of faith she had needed. On the fourth day, Harlan Voss rode back to the property. He did not come to the fence this time. He rode straight up the lane to the house, and he had a different man with him, younger, with the look of a hired legal clerk, carrying a leather satchel. Celia heard the horses and came out onto the porch with her arms crossed. She noted that she was not afraid of him, which surprised her slightly, and then recognized that what she felt instead was a controlled and focused anger, which was more useful. Told you 2 weeks, Voss said pleasantly, pulling up his horse, but my schedule moved up. I thought it only fair to give you advance notice. We'll be marking the eastern boundary day after tomorrow. You will not, Celia said. He cocked his head with patient amusement. Mrs. Kingsley, I don't think you understand the legal position you're in. I understand my position quite well, she said. I have retained representation, and we have filed a challenge to the transfer on jurisdictional grounds. If you set a single marker on that eastern pasture before the Taos Land Office has reviewed the competing filings, you will be in violation of the Territorial Dispute Code, Section 14, which prohibits action on contested claims during the review period. She had memorized that from Walter's notes, which he had sent via messenger the day before. She said it with the same steady voice she used when she was telling me something important. Voss's pleasant expression thinned slightly. Who did you find to represent you? That is my business, she said. He looked at her for a long moment, then looked at the land, then looked back at her. 2 weeks ago, I offered you $400. The offer expires at the end of this month. Then it will expire, she said. Good day, Mr. Voss. He turned his horse and rode back down the lane. His clerk followed without having opened the satchel. Celia did not move from the porch until they were out of sight, and then she sat down on the top step and let out a long, slow breath and pressed the heels of her hands against her knees. Her hands were shaking, but only a little, and only from the release of tension held tight. Me's voice came from inside the house, asking something about dinner, and Celia called back to her in a normal voice and stood up and went inside. Walter returned to the property on the 6th day, and this time he had documents. He tied his horse at the post and came up the porch steps with his notebook and a leather envelope, and when Celia opened the door he was already saying, "I found it." Carol's original filing in Taos uses a different datum point for the eastern boundary than the Santa Fe transfer does. When Voss's clerk drew up the transfer deed, they shifted the reference point by 30 feet. That might not sound like much, but it means the parcel he claims to own is not legally identical to the parcel Carol originally filed. The boundaries do not precisely match. Celia opened the door wider and stepped back. "Come in." He spread the documents on the kitchen table and walked her through it. The original Carroll survey had used a specific rock formation at the top of a ridge as its northeast anchor point. The Santa Fe transfer used coordinates that, when plotted on the federal survey grid, placed the anchor point 30 feet south of that rock formation. It was the kind of discrepancy that looked like a clerical error, and it might well have been, but it was sufficient to make the transfer legally imprecise. If the boundary was not the same boundary, the title was not for the same land. Hector Diaz confirmed that the clerk in Santa Fe did not cross-reference the Taos original, Walter said. He used only the coordinates Voss's attorney provided. That means the recorded transfer has a title defect. "Can we have it voided?" Celia asked. "We can challenge it, and with the discrepancy documented, any territorial judge should grant an injunction pending a proper resurvey. The resurvey would need to go back to the Taos original, which resolves the anchor point in your favor." He paused, looking down at the map. "There's also something else." He found a page in his notebook. Carroll filed his claim in July of 1876, but I pulled the Colfax County territorial records from that summer, and there's a problem with his filing date. July of 1876 was right in the middle of the Cimarron unrest. The county recording office was suspended for 3 weeks in July because the recorder's office was damaged during the Grant War troubles. Technically, Carroll's filing could not have been received and officially registered until the office reopened in August of 1876, which means his effective registration date may be August, not July. Celia looked up from the map. "Which would make it after Thomas's claim?" "Possibly simultaneous, which under territorial law means it goes to the prior occupant for settlement. Your husband had been living on this land since 1872. Carroll never occupied the eastern 40 at all. He was a speculative filer. The law is not silent on that distinction." Celia sat down. She pressed her hands flat against the table and let herself feel, for the first time in a very long while, something approaching hope. Real hope, not the forced variety she manufactured every morning for me's benefit. "You found all of this in 6 days." Walter sat down across from her, and there was something in his expression that was hard to read, a combination of professionalism and something more personal. "I have been doing this work for 6 years, he said, "and I have seen Harlan Voss's name attached to 3 other disputed claims in this territory. He finds properties held by people who are unlikely to fight back, widows and older homesteaders and families without connections, and he files paper arguments that are technically sound enough to intimidate but not always sound enough to hold up under scrutiny. Most of the time, people don't fight. They take what he offers and leave." "He chose the wrong widow," Celia said. Walter looked at her with something in his dark eyes that she could not quite categorize, and then he smiled, which changed his whole face. It was not a performed smile or a polite one. It was the real kind, the kind that caught a person off guard with its warmth. "Yes," he said, "he did." Me came in from the back of the house at that moment, her hair loose from its braid and her shoes in her hand, which meant she had been out in the creek again. Celia gave her a look, and me sat down and put her shoes on with dignity. She looked at the papers on the table. "Is that about our land?" she asked. "It is," Walter said, "and it's looking good." "I knew it would," me said simply. "Mama doesn't let go of things." Walter looked at Celia over the little girl's head with an expression that was warm and amused and something else, something quieter, and Celia felt heat rise to her face and looked down at the documents. "I will make supper," she said. "You should stay. It is too late to ride back to town before dark and the road past the ridge gets hard to see." It came out more casually than she felt, and she was grateful for that. Walter paused, and she thought for a moment that he might decline, which would have been the sensible and proper thing. "Thank you," he said. "I'd appreciate that." Supper was beans and salt pork and the last of the winter's dried apples made into a rough compote, served with fresh bread that Celia had made that morning. It was a simple meal, the kind the land produced when you did not have time for anything elaborate, but nobody treated it as anything less than sufficient. Pete and Sam Greer ate at the far end of the long table, and they were polite to Walter in the careful way of men who had appointed themselves protectors of a household and were sizing up an addition. By the end of the meal, Pete had asked Walter 3 questions about land survey work, and Sam had told a long story about a boundary dispute he had witnessed in Kansas, and the table felt, for the first time in months, like a place where a household was gathered rather than a widow and her daughter eating alone. After Me was in bed, Celia and Walter sat on the porch. The April night was cold and she had her shawl around her shoulders, and the sky above the mesa was thick with stars the way New Mexico skies are when the moon is not up yet. They sat in the 2 wooden chairs Thomas had made, and for a while neither of them said anything, and it was not uncomfortable. "Can I ask you something?" Walter said. "Yes." "When Voss first came to you back in January, why didn't you take his offer? I know it was insultingly low, but it would have made things easier." Celia was quiet for a moment, watching a star move across the southern edge of the sky. "Because Thomas built this," she said. "Not for himself in the end because he is gone. He built it for me." So she would have ground beneath her feet that was hers. "This is her inheritance. I am not allowed to sell it." Walter turned his head and looked at her profile in the dark. "Most people would call that stubborn." "Most people would be right," she said. "But most people haven't stood at a grave on a cold November morning and made a promise." Walter was quiet. Then, after a moment, "I made a promise at a grave once too." She turned to look at him. He was looking out at the dark pasture, his jaw set in a way that suggested something old. "My younger brother," he said. "He died on the trail in '73, fever. He was 22. He had wanted to see Colorado." He paused. "I went to Colorado for him. Spent a year there. Then I kept moving, kept working. I think I have been moving ever since and not quite knowing why or toward what." Celia listened to this and felt something expand in her chest, not pity, which would have been wrong, but recognition. The particular loneliness of carrying a purpose that has no one left to witness it. "You are 22 years old and have not stopped to ask yourself if you are going the right direction," she said. He was 10 years younger than her, she thought, but then she calculated again. He had said 6 years working the territory, 3 years in Denver before that. He was older than his words had suggested. "I am 34, he said, as though he had heard the thought, "and I have not answered that question yet." They sat in the dark for a while longer. The cattle moved in the pasture with quiet sounds, the shift of weight and breath. An owl called from the juniper on the hill. Celia eventually said good night and went inside, and Walter slept in the bunkhouse with Pete and Sam, which was the proper arrangement, and which she was relieved about because otherwise she would have lain awake for entirely different reasons. Over the following 10 days, things moved with more speed than she had expected. Walter had already drafted the challenge filing before he came back to the property, and he rode to Santa Fe with it himself rather than sending it by post, because he wanted to deliver it to the territorial land court in person and ensure it was accepted. He was gone for 4 days, and Celia found herself noting his absence in a way that annoyed her slightly, because she had not had 4 quiet days in months and should have been relieved by them. She was not relieved. She was preoccupied with the case, she told herself. She needed to know what was happening. That was all. He returned on the 4th afternoon with dust on his coat and a look of contained satisfaction. The filing had been accepted. A territorial judge had reviewed the jurisdictional argument and granted a 30-day injunction on any transfer actions pending the resurvey. Harlan Voss could not put a single marker on that eastern pasture for at least 30 days, and during the resurvey, which would be conducted by an independent federal surveyor. All of Walter's evidence about the anchor point discrepancy and the recording office suspension would be formally submitted. 30 days, Celia repeated. It might be enough. The resurvey should take 2 weeks. If the federal surveyor confirms the anchor point discrepancy, which I believe he will because it's documented in the Taos records, the transfer will be voided. Voss will still own Carol's original claim, but Carol's claim will be mapped accurately, and based on the recording office suspension evidence, your husband's filing may well be found senior. And if the judge does not agree about the recording suspension, Walter looked at her steadily. Then the 2 claims are simultaneous, which means occupancy takes precedence, and your husband was the occupant. I think we win either way, but I want you to know there is no certainty. There is never certainty in this country, Celia said. You work with what you have. He smiled at that and she looked away. The following 2 weeks had a different quality to them. The immediate crisis had a pause in it. A legal breathing room and life on the homestead continued its seasonal rhythms. It was now late April and the spring work was accumulating. The kitchen garden needed turning and planting. The south pasture fence had a long section that had been damaged by winter weight. The cattle were calving, which meant late nights and early mornings. Walter stayed. He had not formally discussed it. He had come back from Santa Fe and had simply continued to be present, helping with the calving on the second night because Pete had pulled a calf the wrong way and needed another set of hands, and it had seemed natural after that. He worked the property in the mornings and worked on the legal documentation in the afternoons, and he ate at the table and talked to me about her book, and did not make any declarations or press any situation that was not ready to be pressed. Celia watched him and tried to be honest with herself, which was a discipline she had always demanded of herself. She was drawn to him. She recognized it not as the sudden bright thing of youth, but as the steadier recognition of a woman who had been loved well and knew what good character looked like when it was sitting across the table from her. He was careful and thorough and patient. He was honest about uncertainty. He was kind to me without being excessive about it, without performing affection, but offering it genuinely in small doses that a child could trust. But it had been 6 months since Thomas died. She was still finding her footing in the new shape of her life. She was not sure she was ready. She was also, she noted with a private wryness, 31 years old and the sole proprietor of a challenged homestead with a 7-year-old daughter and 2 hired hands to look after, which meant that the question of readiness perhaps needed to be weighed against the fact that life was not generous with the men who listened carefully and worked hard and smiled in the way that changed their whole faces. On a Wednesday morning in the first week of May, she was planting the kitchen garden and he was repairing the south section of the fence, and he came around the corner of the house at midday for the water bucket and found her on her knees in the dirt with her hat pushed back on her head and her gloves off because she preferred the feel of the soil when she planted. He stopped at the corner of the house. She looked up. They were about 12 feet apart and the light was the particular clear gold of a New Mexico spring noon, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "You have dirt on your face," he said. "I am planting," she said. "I know. Did you need something?" "Water," he said. But he did not move to get it yet. Celia sat back on her heels and looked at him. She had been thinking about this moment without quite knowing she was building toward it, and now that it had arrived she decided to be the one who named it, because she had never been good at waiting when she knew what she thought. "Walter," she said, "I want to be straightforward with you about something." He came a few feet closer and crouched down, bringing himself to her level, which she noted as characteristic. "All right," he said. "I am grateful for what you are doing, for the case and for everything else, and I want you to know that those 2 things are separate in my mind. What I think of you as a man and what I need from you as a legal advocate, they are not connected." He was watching her carefully. "I understand. Good. Because I also want to say that what I think of you as a man is considerable, and I am not yet sure what to do with that because it has been 6 months and I am still finding my way in this new life. but I did not want to be dishonest about it by saying nothing. Walter was quiet for long enough that she had one moment of genuine doubt, the kind that arrives in the gap between saying something true and waiting for the response. Then he said, "I have been trying to figure out how to say something like that for about 10 days now, and you did it better than I would have." Something unwound in her chest. "That is not a high bar. You are usually quite articulate." "Not about this," he said. "I don't have a lot of practice." "Neither do I," she said. "We will have to be patient with each other." He looked at her with those dark eyes and that quality of attention that she had come to think of as one of his defining features. "I can do that," he said. "I am very good at patient," she laughed. It was a real laugh, not the polite kind, and it surprised her with its own warmth, the way laughing sometimes does when you have been serious for too long. He got his water and went back to the fence, and she went back to her planting, and nothing had changed except that everything was different, which is the particular mathematics of honesty between two people who have decided to acknowledge something real. The federal surveyor arrived in the third week of May, a methodical man named Bryce Halloran who had been doing survey work in the territory for 15 years and who took one look at Walter's documentation and said, "I have seen this kind of discrepancy before. Let's go look at the land." Celia and Walter went with him to the eastern boundary. He spent a full day on the land with his instruments, measuring from the rock formation at the ridge, checking the coordinates, comparing them to both the Taos original and the Santa Fe transfer. He made no comments about what he was finding while he worked, which was typical of his profession, but at the end of the day when they were walking back to the house, he stopped at the fence line and marked something in his notebook and said, "The anchor point in the transfer is 32 feet south of the original. The surveyed parcels are not the same." Celia looked at Walter. Walter looked at the surveyor. "Will that be in your report?" he asked. "It will be in my report," Halloran said, "along with the Taos recording date issue which I have already verified through the district archive. Carroll's filing was not logged until August 14, 1876. He paused and closed his notebook. "Your husband's amendment was filed September 2, 1876, which means they are not simultaneous. Carroll's is senior by 18 days. The ground did not shift this time. It was solid." "But the occupancy provision," Celia said. "Under territorial law, a speculative filing that precedes an occupant's claim by less than 30 days is subject to the occupancy override provision if the speculative filer never established use or improvement. Carroll never broke ground on that 40 acres. Your husband had been working adjacent land since 1872 and had cattled the eastern pasture since 1874. Halloran looked at her over his notebook. "I'm not a judge, Mrs. Kingsley, but I have been doing this long enough to say that this survey report is going to make your case very strong." They stood in the late afternoon light on the boundary of her land, and Celia felt Thomas's presence very specifically in that moment, not as grief but as something warmer and less defined, the sense of a man who had made good choices standing somewhere behind the legacy of those choices, present in the evidence of them. "Thank you," she said to the surveyor, and her voice was steady. The report went to the Territorial Land Court in Santa Fe in the last week of May. Harlan Voss, through his attorney, filed a response, but it was thin. His attorney had counted on intimidation succeeding before it came to this, and faced with a federal survey report, a documented title defect, and the occupancy override provision, the legal argument on his side shrank considerably. The judge reviewing the case, a man named Marcus Reeves who had a reputation for thorough work, issued his ruling on June the 8th, 1878. The transfer of Carroll's claim to Harlan Voss was voided due to title defect. Carroll's original claim, accurately resurveyed, did not overlap with the Kingsley property boundaries when properly anchored. The eastern pasture, the creek bed, and the south water access remained part of the Kingsley homestead. Walter brought the ruling to the property himself. He rode up the lane on a warm June morning and came up the porch steps, and Celia was already there because she had seen him from the kitchen window and had been standing very still for a moment, reading his posture, because a man carries a ruling in his body before he speaks it. He was carrying it well. He held out the document, and she took it and read it, and when she looked up her eyes were bright with something she did not try to keep off her face. "It is done," he said. "It is done," she confirmed. Me, who had been listening from inside the door, erupted onto the porch and flung her arms around her mother's waist, and Celia held her daughter close with one arm and held the ruling in her other hand, and looked at Walter Alden over me's head and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed to be said with words at that particular moment. Pete and Sam Greer, when they heard the news that evening, were quietly and emphatically pleased. Pete opened a bottle of rye whiskey that he had been saving for a specific good occasion, and they all sat on the porch in the long June evening, and Sam told a story that was funnier in the retelling than it had been at the time, about a land dispute he had witnessed in his younger years that had ended with someone's mule being declared a legal witness, and everyone laughed, and the property sat in the warm evening light looking exactly like what it was, which was a home. Walter's government assignment was technically complete. He had been in Cimarron since March, and the Maxwell Grant boundary review had concluded 3 weeks prior. He had been extending his stay under the pretext of the survey case, which had been legitimate, and now the case was resolved. He had a decision to make, and he had known it was coming. On the second evening after the ruling, he and Celia walked out to the eastern pasture in the long summer light, just the two of them, which had not happened before without the pretext of checking boundaries or reviewing survey marks. They walked along the fence line to the creek and stood at the bank where the water ran thin and clear over flat stones, and the cottonwoods along the creek were fully leafed, and the light through them was green and gold. "I have to report back to Denver," he said. "My supervisor has been generous with the time I've spent here, but I owe them my presence." Celia was looking at the water. "I know," she said. "I don't want to go." She looked at him. "I want to be honest about that," he said. "The same way you were honest about what you were thinking. I don't want to go back to Denver. I have not wanted anything this specifically in a long time." He paused. "I also don't want to ask you for something you are not ready for. You have had a hard year and you are in the middle of rebuilding, and I have no right to walk into that and make it complicated." "You have not made it complicated," Celia said. "You have made it simpler. Considerably simpler since you helped me keep my water access." His mouth curved. "That is a very practical way to frame what I am trying to say." "I am a practical woman," she said, "but I also know what you are trying to say and I want you to say it directly." He turned to face her fully. The evening light was on his face and the cottonwoods were moving slightly in the warm air and the creek made its small constant sound. "I would like to come back," he said. "Not as your legal advocate, which I am no longer, but as a man who would like to court you properly if you are willing to be courted." Celia looked at him for a long moment. She felt the pull of practicality and the pull of caution and the pull of the 6 months just ended, and she felt behind all of that the steady, present fact of this man who had spent 2 months on her property and had done nothing but be exactly who he said he was. "I am willing," she said. He let out a breath that told her he had been holding it, which was gratifying to know. He reached out and took her hand, which she gave him, and they stood by the creek for a while with the evening falling gently around them, and neither of them needed to say anything more than what had already been said. He rode to Cimarron the next morning to send a letter to his supervisor in Denver requesting a permanent transfer or resignation, depending on what they were willing to offer. He was not uncertain about the direction. He was, he told himself, 34 years old, which was old enough to stop being a man who moved and start being a man who stayed. The response from Denver came back in 2 weeks. His supervisor, a bureaucratic but fair man named Abernathy, offered him a transfer to the Territorial Land Survey Office in Santa Fe, which was a permanent posting with the same federal salary. It was, Walter suspected. A generous accommodation for a man who had been a valuable employee for 6 years, and who Abernathy would rather keep in the service than lose entirely. Walter wrote back his acceptance, and then rode out to the Kingsley homestead with the letter in his pocket. He arrived to find Celia and Pete Greer in the middle of a significant disagreement about the fence on the north pasture, which had been repaired 3 times in the spring and was failing again. And Pete was arguing for entirely new posts, and Celia was arguing for reinforcing the existing ones, because the cost of new posts was not in the budget until the autumn cattle sale. They were standing at the north fence speaking with intensity, and Celia had her hands on her hips, and Pete was making the particular face of a man who knows he is right but also knows he is probably going to lose the argument. Walter tied his horse, walked over, looked at the fence, looked at Pete and said, "New posts in the corners, reinforcement on the intermediaries, splits the cost." Pete pointed at him in the manner of a man vindicated. Celia looked at Walter with narrowed eyes, then at the fence, then sighed with the elegant resignation of someone who recognizes a logical compromise. "That will work," she said. "But only if we get the cedar posts from the Taos supplier, not the Santa Fe price." "Taos supplier," Pete said immediately. "Absolutely." She looked at Walter again, and now her eyes were not narrowed, they were warm, and there was a small private smile at the corner of her mouth that he had learned to read. "You have good timing," she said, "in multiple respects." He pulled out the letter from Abernathy and told her about the transfer. She read it in the afternoon sun, still at the fence line, with Pete pretending not to listen with considerable effort. When she finished reading, she handed it back to him and looked up at him with those river-colored eyes, and she said, "Santa Fe is a reasonable distance." "I thought so," he said. "The survey work will still take you away sometimes." "It will, but you intend to base yourself here." "I intend to base myself here," he said, "if you will have me." Pete suddenly remembered something he needed to do in the barn and left with notable speed. Celia watched him go with a slight smile and then looked back at Walter. "I will have you," she said. "Though I should tell you that running this place is not simple, and me is 7 and opinionated, and the north fence is apparently never going to cooperate. I have been here for 2 months," he said. "I know what I'm accepting." "Good," she said. "Then we understand each other." He took her hand again. At the fence line with the summer sun on the north pasture and the cattle moving in the distance, and she stood beside him and they looked over the land together, and it felt like something that had been coming toward itself for a long time. The courtship was conducted at the pace that life on a working homestead permits, which is slower than either party might have chosen, but which has its own honest quality, because you get to know a person by the way they behave in the middle of ordinary difficulty, rather than in the choreographed conditions of parlor visits. Walter was based in Cimarron while the Santa Fe transfer was processed, which took most of the summer, and he rode out to the Kingsley property 3 or 4 times a week, which was frequent enough to be meaningful but not so constant as to be anything other than sincere. He learned the rhythms of the place. He helped with the late summer branding and did not make a fuss about it being difficult work. He fixed the water pump when it seized in August, using a method he had learned from a Mexican mechanic in Denver that involved a specific wrapping of leather around the valve, and which Pete Greer found impressive enough to ask about twice. He played cards on the porch evenings with Pete and Sam, who had by now accepted him without ceremony, which was their version of high praise. He read to me when Celia was occupied with accounting, and he was good at it, doing different voices for different characters in a way that made me laugh and tell him he was silly, which was also her version of high praise. He and Celia had long conversations on the porch after me was asleep, the way they had started in April, but different now because there was no case to anchor the conversation to. They talked about his brother, about Kansas, about the surveying work and the things he had seen across the territory. She told him about meeting Thomas, about the early years of the homestead when they had lived in a single room while the house was built, about the first winter being harder than anything she had imagined and more vivid and alive than anything before it. She told him what Thomas had been like. She did it without the particular careful grief of early morning, but with the more settled honesty of a woman who had loved a man thoroughly and had buried him, and was now on the other side of that grief. Not past it exactly, because grief does not really have a far side, but integrated into it, carrying it alongside the living. Walter listened to this with the same full attention he gave everything, and he did not try to compete with the memory of Thomas or diminish it or position himself in contrast to it. He simply held the space for it, which was exactly the right thing to do, and which told Celia more about his character than most other things could have. In September, Voss made one final appearance. He rode to the property, not with his clerk and his display of legal papers, but alone, and he rode up to the house looking like a man who has spent the summer digesting a defeat, and has arrived at something philosophical about it, which was not his most natural disposition, but which age and occasional setback can produce in even the sharpest of operators. Celia met him on the porch. Walter was there too, having arrived that morning, and he stood at the edge of the porch with his arms crossed, present but not forward. Voss looked at Walter for a moment, then at Celia. "I wanted to tell you personally," he said, "that I have withdrawn from the Carroll claim entirely. Sold my interest back to the estate at a loss." He said this without obvious rancor, which was interesting. "You fought a good fight, Mrs. Kingsley. I underestimated you." Celia looked at him steadily. "You underestimated the land records," she said, "and the man who knew how to read them." Voss glanced at Walter again with an expression that acknowledged this plainly. "That too," he said. He touched his hat. "I don't imagine we'll have further business." "No," Celia said. "I don't imagine we will." He rode away, and she watched him go with the same steadiness she had shown in April, except that this time the watching held no anxiety. The land was secure. The creek ran on her property and would continue to. The cattle were watered and the fence was mended and the autumn grasses were yellowing over the hill where Thomas was buried, and the world had returned to its proper proportions. She became aware that Walter was looking at her. She turned and met his eyes. "Finished," she said. "Finished," he agreed. She crossed to him on the porch and he put his arm around her shoulders, which was new, physical closeness in the daylight where the Greer brothers could see. And she let herself settle into the warmth of it and looked out over her land, their land in some sense that was still forming itself, and felt the particular peace of a battle well concluded. The transfer to the Santa Fe office came through in October, and Walter moved his few possessions from the Cimarron Hotel to a rented room in Santa Fe, which was close enough for regular visits and far enough to be a reasonable arrangement before things were formalized. He was on the road between Santa Fe and the homestead often enough that he became a familiar figure to the people along the route, the man on the dark roan who rode the northeast road with the look of someone going somewhere he wanted to be. On a Sunday afternoon in early November, nearly a year after Thomas's death, Walter asked Celia to marry him. He did it on the porch, not with elaborate staging, but with the directness that was natural to both of them. He told her that he loved her, which he had not said before in so many words, and that he wanted to make a life on this land with her and me, and that he would not ask her to rush anything that needed more time, but that he wanted her to know his intentions clearly. Celia stood with her hands in the pockets of her work apron and looked at him for a moment that lasted long enough for him to wonder if he had miscalculated the timing. Then she said, "I love you, Walter." "Yes." He took her face in his hands and kissed her in the November afternoon, with the juniper on the hill behind the house and the cattle in the pasture, and me watching from the kitchen window, with the dignified satisfaction of a child who has decided something months ago and waited for the adults to arrive at the same conclusion. They married in December of 1878 at the small church in Cimarron, which was a plain white building that held about 60 people, and held closer to 80 on that particular Saturday. Because the Greer brothers had a large family, and the Santa Fe office had sent 3 colleagues of Walter's and half of Cimarron, had developed an interest in the outcome of the Kingsley land dispute, and considered their presence at the wedding to be a form of civic participation. Me stood up beside her mother during the ceremony and held the flowers with the gravity of a person performing an important function. And when the minister said the words that made them a family, she looked up at Walter with the same frank assessment she had given him the first morning, and whatever she found in his face satisfied her, because she took his hand on the way out of the church and held it the entire walk to the hotel where the celebration was being held, and did not let go until she needed both hands for the cake. The winter was a settling time. Walter's work took him to Santa Fe for stretches of the week, but he came home to the homestead on Fridays and stayed through Monday, and the rhythms of the household rearranged themselves around this without difficulty, because Walter fit in the way things fit when they are the right size for the space. He took over the accounting in the evenings, not because Celia could not do it, but because she was better at the cattle work and he was faster with numbers, and they had discovered early that they divided labor by genuine aptitude rather than convention, which suited them both. In the spring of 1879, as the grass came back green on the eastern pasture, and the creek ran with the snowmelt from the hills, Celia told Walter she was expecting. She told him in the morning, in the kitchen, with the coffee on the stove and me at school in Cimarron, and he went very still for a moment in the way of a person receiving news that is both expected and absolutely astonishing. Then he crossed to her and held her close for a long time, neither of them saying anything, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and felt the solidity of him, the realness of this life they had built out of a land dispute and an honest conversation and 2 people who had decided, separately and then together, to stop moving and stay. "Are you frightened?" she asked. "Yes," he said honestly. "Are you?" "A little," she said, "but mostly I am glad." "So am I," he said, "completely." Summer brought the full heat and the work of a running homestead, and Celia worked through most of it with characteristic refusal to be diminished by her physical condition, though she did accept Walter's quiet insistence on taking the harder fence-mending work off her hands in August, which she accepted without argument, which meant it was the right time to accept it. In October of 1879, their son was born. He was healthy and loud, and had Walter's dark eyes and Celia's auburn coloring, and a personality that declared itself immediately as one that would require significant management. They named him Thomas James Alden, Thomas for the man who had built the homestead and James for Walter's younger brother who had wanted to see Colorado. It was a name that held both their histories in it, which seemed exactly right. Me, now 8 years old, took her role as older sister with the same seriousness she brought to everything, and she appointed herself an authority on the subject of infants, with absolutely no prior experience and a great deal of confidence, which made Walter and Celia exchange amused looks across the dinner table, with the frequency of parents who have found that raising children together is one of the better things humans can do. Pete and Sam Greer stayed on the property through all of this and into the following years, becoming fixtures of the Alden household in the way of people who have been present through the hard times and therefore belong to the good ones also. Pete eventually married a woman named Dolers from Cimarron, and Sam remained single and determinedly happy about it. And they all celebrated these choices with the easy warmth of people who have become a chosen family by proximity and shared work. The land itself continued to grow in value and in substance. Walter used his knowledge of survey law to expand the Kingsley homestead carefully and legally over the next several years, acquiring 2 additional parcels to the north through proper channels when they became available. One from a retired Army man who was moving back east, and one through a government homestead, filing that Walter knew how to navigate precisely, because it was his area of expertise. By 1882, the property was close to 400 acres, which was significant for a private holding in that part of the territory, and more importantly, it was debt-free and productive, with a cattle herd that was the envy of several neighbors and a kitchen garden that Celia had expanded into something close to a market garden, selling produce to Cimarron in the summer months through an arrangement with the dry goods store. Me grew into an extraordinary young woman, practical and fierce and deeply thoughtful in the particular way of children who have watched their parents navigate difficulty with dignity. She had her mother's determination and her stepfather's patience, which was a combination that served her extremely well as she grew older. Walter taught her surveying when she was 12, not as a lesson, but because she asked him to, and he could not think of a single reason not to teach a willing, intelligent child a useful skill. She was better at the compass work than any of his colleagues, which he told her straight out, and which she accepted without false modesty. Thomas grew into the land the way children do, when the land is the first thing they know. He was 5 years old and riding a horse with confidence, 7 years old and helping with the branding, 10 years old and claiming to know the property better than anyone else, which was possibly true and certainly not an argument worth winning. He had his mother's stubbornness and his father's precision, and the combination produced a young man who was going to be formidable by any measure. In the summer of 1883, a second child arrived. Another boy, William, who had Celia's green-gray eyes and an expression of permanent, thoughtful calculation that made Walter laugh every time he looked at him. The house was full in the way that good houses become full, with noise and cooking and the specific chaos of a working homestead that is also raising children. And Walter stood on the porch sometimes in the early mornings, before anyone else was awake, and looked out over the land and the hills and the juniper on the rise where Thomas Kingsley was buried, and felt the full weight of what he had found here. He had come to Cimarron in March of 1878 on temporary government business, expecting to be there 2 weeks, and then return to the regular pattern of his professional life, moving through the territory, doing careful work, being competent and unremarkable and unattached. He had been planning to go to Colorado in the fall, perhaps, not for his brother this time, but just because he had heard the land was different there, and different was what he chased. He thought about that sometimes, how close it had been, how easily he could have been on a different road when Celia Kingsley came out of that hotel looking for her absent lawyer, how the whole of this life had balanced on the small pivot of a man reading a surveying manual on a hotel porch and looking up at the right moment. He believed in careful work and documented evidence and jurisdictional accuracy, which was his professional creed, but standing on the porch in the early morning with the smell of coffee beginning to come through the kitchen window, he also believed in something less quantifiable, the way certain things find each other, the way a woman who refuses to let go of what is hers and a man who has been moving without direction can recognize in each other the thing they have been missing without being able to name it. Celia found him on the porch one such morning, as she sometimes did, and she brought 2 cups of coffee and stood beside him the way they had stood at the creek the first summer, looking out over the land together. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "The hotel porch in Cimarron," he said. "March of '78. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I think about that too sometimes, about what would have happened if Marsh hadn't been in Santa Fe." "You would have found another way," he said. "You would not have given up the land." "Probably not," she agreed, "but I would not have found you." He looked at her. The early morning light was on her face, and her hair was loose, and she had her coffee cup in both hands the way she always did in the cold. She was 36 years old and the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, which had nothing to do with the quality of the light and everything to do with the person he knew her to be. "I would not have found you either," he said. She looked at him with those river-colored eyes, and she smiled, and he put his arm around her on the porch of the house on the land they had fought for and built and were still building, and they watched the New Mexico morning come in over the hills, gold and clear and vast, the way mornings are in that country when the world is right. The juniper on the hill caught the first light and held it, and the cattle moved in the eastern pasture, and somewhere in the house Me was waking up, as she did every morning, ready for whatever the day had in it. and small William was making the particular sounds of an infant deciding whether to be pleased or displeased about being conscious. And Thomas would be at the fence within the hour, because Thomas was always at the fence by sunrise, having appointed himself the first surveyor of each new day. Walter thought about his brother, as he sometimes allowed himself to do. James had wanted to see Colorado. Walter had gone to Colorado for him, and then to New Mexico, and had kept moving until he found a porch in Cimarron and a woman who needed someone who could read a land deed and had stopped. He thought James would have found this funny and good, which was the right combination. "Voss has a new operation south of Taos," Celia said. "I heard from Dolers that he filed on 2 parcels near the river." "I heard," Walter said. "His paperwork is better than it used to be. He hired a proper attorney." "Good," she said, which surprised him. He looked at her. She explained. "If he is more careful with his paperwork, he is less likely to try the same thing with us again. The last time cost him more than he planned." This was true and practical, and exactly the way her mind worked. "You have become remarkably philosophical about the man who tried to take your water access," Walter said. "I have everything I need," she said simply. "Philosophy is easier when you have everything you need." He laughed, and she laughed with him, and the morning continued to arrive. And in the house their children were waking, and the land was whole, and the deed to 400 acres in Colfax County, New Mexico, rested in the cedar box on the shelf in the parlor where Thomas Kingsley had once kept his survey papers, and where Walter Alden had added his own name in the winter of 1878. And where the name Kingsley Alden had been formally registered with the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe in a ceremony that Gerald Marsh, back from his travels and thoroughly delighted by the whole story, had called the best legal outcome he had seen in 15 years of territorial practice. Mie appeared at the kitchen door with her hair braided and her surveying compass in her pocket, which she carried the way other children carried toys, and she called out to them, asking if there was coffee left and whether her father was going to ride the north boundary today because she had seen a fence post that looked concerning. Walter called back that yes, there was coffee, and yes, he was going to check the north boundary, and yes, she could come with him, which was never really a question but always a courtesy to ask. She disappeared back inside, satisfied, and Walter and Celia stood for one more moment in the morning quiet, and she put her head briefly against his shoulder the way she sometimes did, a small gesture that held in it all the things that did not need to be said. Then she straightened up and handed him her coffee cup to hold and went inside to make breakfast, because there was a homestead to run and children to feed, and a north fence that apparently needed attention, and the day was already full and bright and entirely, uncomplicatedly theirs. He stood on the porch of the house they had made together, with her coffee cup warm in his hand, and looked at the land that she had refused to surrender, and that he had helped her keep, and that they had turned into something neither of them could have built alone. And he thought that if he had been asked at 19 or 24 or even 30 what he was moving toward, he would not have been able to describe this. He would not have had the vocabulary for a specific woman on a specific porch in the New Mexico morning, or for the way a family can grow out of a land deed and a disputed boundary, and 2 people willing to tell the truth about what they felt. But he had moved toward it anyway, all those years, down all those roads, through Colorado and Kansas and the whole length and width of the territory, until he had arrived at the right porch at the right moment and looked up from a surveying manual and found the beginning of everything he had not known to look for. He went inside to help with breakfast, and the door closed behind him, and the land stretched out in every direction in the warm morning light, patient and enduring and profoundly, quietly content.